Hi. So in my early 30s, I lived in Singapore, and I spent a lot of time drinking champagne on yachts and frozen cocktails on beaches and rosé wine on rooftop bars. I had a real kind of fast-growing career, a wonderful boyfriend, and every other weekend we would travel to tropical destinations. So I would finish work at 5 p.m. on a Friday in Singapore, and I could be in Bali by dinner time. So my social media feed looked fantastic. I was also a raging alcoholic. These are some pictures from my social media feed, from Facebook, because I'm old. And what you can see here is me drinking some champagne on a yacht, celebrating someone's 30th birthday party. What you don't see is that I have no memory after about 5 p.m. And I woke up the next day covered in scrapes and bruises because I fell into a bush and couldn't get out. And that is not the only time I fell into a bush. Many, many bushes have been fallen into in my time. What you see here is me and my boyfriend enjoying Prosecco on a Friday night at the Clarke Quay in Singapore. What you don't see is we had a massive row about something I'd done previously when drunk, and he got angry and left, and I stayed there drinking by myself, and then passed out in the chair and had the waiters considering calling the police to decide what to do with me. This is my wedding day. He did actually marry me, even so. And what you can see here is us drinking champagne on the rooftop bar of the Hong Kong Four Seasons by the pool. What you don't see is a month before, my mum had died suddenly, and I'd spent about 4 weeks drinking very, very heavily. So when it got to this day, I felt so sick I could barely eat or drink anything. So what I'm trying to say is you don't need to be drinking double-strength lager out of a paper bag under a bridge to be an addict. You can be drinking champagne on a yacht. I made so many excuses for my drinking. Oh, I'm not as bad as them. Like, I don't drink vodka in the morning. Like, I'm not physically addicted. Plus, I'm a nice, white, middle-class girl with a good job and a loving family. I am not an addict. I am fine. I'd get so caught up in the semantics of what an addict meant, what an alcoholic was. I'm not physically addicted to this substance. You know, there are so many ways in which I could not relate to that idea of being an alcoholic. I would wax lyrical to my friends at 3 a.m. over booze and cigarettes. I'm not, yes, I have a problem with drinking, but I'm not an alcoholic. And if I'm not an alcoholic, then I don't have to stop drinking, right? And to be honest, it felt safer. It felt safer to be the girl who likes a drink, who's a bit of a lush, than to be the person who puts that label on themselves, that label of addiction, of alcoholic, and have to step away. And when it comes to labels, I think that the term alcoholic is quite outdated. It actually refers to being like physically addicted to alcohol. So the idea that you'd go into withdrawal if you suddenly stop drinking. But there are so many people in the world whose lives are ruined, whose mental health is destroyed by alcohol without ever being physically addicted to it. And there's often this image that's brought up when it comes to, saying things like addict or alcoholic, which is someone who's lost everything, lost their job, lost their family, is a real down and out, unreliable, a liability, lying in the gutter covered in their own wee. But I think that gives a lot of problem drinkers the excuse to say, well, I'm not any of those things, so I must be fine. Whereas actually, there is a huge void between those things and fine. The day that I accepted that I was addicted was the day that I flipped the definition of addiction on its head. I had no rock bottom moment. I changed how I thought about addiction. And instead of listing all the ways in which I was not addicted, all the things that I wasn't drinking vodka in the morning, I wasn't, turning up to work drunk. I thought about the things that I was. And what I was obsessed with alcohol. I would think about it constantly. When was I next going to have a drink? When wouldn't I drink? When would I, be able to make up it to that friend who I upset when I was drinking? Who could I drink with? Who would drink loads so that they wouldn't judge me and it wouldn't be noticeable? Even when I wasn't drinking, I was thinking about drinking. And that is when I made that reframe, that I was able to accept that I was addicted to alcohol mentally, if not physically. And that I was addicted to a substance that was destroying my mental health, pushing my marriage to the limit, and really impacting my self-esteem. So alcohol is an incredibly addictive substance, like one of the most addictive substances in the world, up with meth and sugar. And it's not a surprise that hundreds of millions of people around the world are addicted to it. What I do find surprising is how many societies and cultures, especially kind of Europe, Western cultures, really revere alcohol. It becomes this kind of, it's celebratory. It's something you drink when you're commiserating, when you're connecting, when you're relaxing. And it becomes that non-negotiable part of a party or a social occasion. Even in work culture, especially certain industries, it becomes that real non-negotiable in terms of boozy lunches, creating those deals over wine, forging relationships in pubs. It feels like you have to drink to be able to get ahead. And they say, alcohol remains the only drug on earth that you have to justify not taking. And I was going to a party, and I was pregnant, and I was driving to the party, and I'm an alcoholic. So I was like, I have got all of the responses when someone says, oh, can't you just have one? And it's amazing. Even being pregnant, even driving, there's still that, oh, you could still just have one. And you don't have to be an addict or be pregnant or driving to be able to say, actually, alcohol doesn't serve me. It stops me from being my best self. I think in this modern world of so many distractions, so many demands, we've all got an unhealthy relationship with something, whether that is alcohol, drugs, social media, work. There's different ways in which we disconnect from how we're feeling. So I want to take you through a bit of the science. So this is the change triangle by Hilary Jacob Hendel. And she talks about our core emotions. So these are our natural core emotions that human beings we experience. And they are joy, fear, anger, sadness, excitement, and sexual excitement. And as human beings, we will all experience most of these throughout our lives. As children, especially millennial children and kind of before, we are taught, be less. Suppress those emotions. Don't be too much. Be agreeable. It's okay to be happy and excited, but not too excited. But don't be sad. Don't cry. It's okay. Don't worry about it. And woe betide you be angry. Tantrums, it's that you're problematic. So you were taught from a very young age to suppress these big, messy emotions. But they're a natural part of being a human being. But we learn how to keep them in, how to numb them, how to avoid them, how to lie about them. And that's when these defenses come in. We all numb in different ways, whether that is disassociation, isolating from people, drinking, scrolling mindlessly on our phone. We've all got ways in which we numb so that we can feel our core emotions less. No one likes discomfort. It's not nice to sit there in those messy emotions. And even when someone who we love is going through stuff, we often jump to, we'll think about this. Let's reframe it. Let's jump to a solution rather than sitting with them in the discomfort, because it feels really uncomfortable to do that sometimes. So Brené Brown, she says, we all numb, but it's those of us who tend to numb compulsively and chronically. That's the definition of addiction. So it's when that numbing becomes a real problem. And when you are, numbing, disconnecting from your core emotions, that might feel helpful when it comes to sadness or anger. It's just kind of wispy, just a little bit out of reach. But also joy, excitement, all of those feelings become further away, feel more numb. And when your core emotions go down and your defenses are up, in come your inhibitory emotions. And these are guilt, anxiety, and shame. I have an anxiety disorder. It's unpleasant feeling anxious all the time, and I often feel anxious kind of most moments of the day. But something keeps me there, because some of these core emotions can be scary. I've lost both of my parents in the past kind of 8 or 9 years. Both of my parents have died. And sometimes the idea of leaning into that despair or that grief feels too scary, like I might fall apart and never put myself together again. And it feels safer to numb. And while I don't drink anymore and haven't drunk for about 6 years, I still numb, chocolate mostly. So it seems easier to eat a bag of mini eggs and sit with anxiety, better the devil you know, than really feel those core emotions. This is my cat Nugget, and it might seem like a tangent, but there is a point to it. About a year ago, Nuggy died. He was hit by a car and taken to the vet, and the vet called us and let us know. Now, Nuggy was an absolute git, right? He was scratchy, he was bitey, he had such an attitude problem. And I loved him with all of my heart. I'd had him for 17 years, and he had been with me through thick and thin. The day that I found out that he died, I felt such like a wave of sadness and emotion. And I just let it come. I felt like I owed it to him to feel it, to really feel it. And it came at me like a wave. And it wasn't pleasant, but it felt right, and it felt pure, and it felt like the right thing that, I should be experiencing. And I'd feel it, and I'd feel it, and then it would pass. And then later in the day, it would come again, and I would feel it, and I would feel it, and then it would pass. And that night, I was so relaxed. It was like I'd been to the spa. I was so relaxed, and I slept incredibly. And that's because defenses were gone. The inhibitory emotions of anxiety had lifted, and I was just connecting with those core emotions. And while it wasn't nice to feel them, it was the right thing to do. I was processing them, and I was connecting with them. Unfortunately, the next day, my coping mechanisms all cranked into place and anxiety went up again. And even if I actively tried to connect with that feeling, that sadness, it just sort of felt a bit grayer, a bit further away, and I found it really hard to connect. And this is something I experienced before seeing the change triangle. But when I learned about the change triangle, I just knew that this was an exact example of that in action. One of the radical learnings that I have in my life is that most of my problems come from not feeling my feelings, not leaning in, numbing them, pouring bottle after bottle of wine on my feelings, not connecting with them, trying to suppress them, not saying the things that I feel, not putting the right boundaries in place, and just experiencing anxiety. And that is something that I'm trying to do, is just let those feelings come, let them wash over you and pass, because when they do that, they move more smoothly than when we fight them, when we numb them, when we ignore them. They just need to be heard. But it's easier said than done. I am still working on it. Many kind of years of unpicking unhealthy coping mechanisms and addiction. And it's so much harder when you've got this stigma and this shame when it comes to mental health, when it comes to addiction and struggles. Especially when you think about how we talk about physical health versus mental health. When we talk about physical health, it's celebrating. Oh, I've been to the gym, I'm running a marathon. And there's no shame in breaking your leg or getting the flu. But when it comes to mental health, it's, I feel too embarrassed to reach out and see a counsellor or to be getting the help I need for my mental health, and feeling all of that stigma attached to things like having anxiety or depression or bipolar. And it's even harder when it comes to addiction. The most famous addiction support network in the world, Alcoholics Anonymous. Right there in the title is the suggestion that being an alcoholic is so shameful that it needs to be anonymous, that we need to talk in quiet, dark rooms about it, never share any further, that it's such a shameful thing to attach to ourselves. I work in well-being, so I talk about my mental health a lot. But even I find myself leaning much more into the mainstream mental health. I talk about my anxiety all the time, but my addiction is a new thing that I'm talking more about, because addiction feels like the dodgy uncle of the mental health family. It's the one that we maybe don't like invite to polite, society parties, and we're all a bit ashamed of. When we think about shame, Brené Brown, she talks about shame as being the fear of disconnect. So as humans, we're tribal creatures. We need to be part of a tribe and we need to be accepted. And when it comes to shame, our fear is that we will be shunned, we will be judged, we'll be stigmatized, and we'll be kind of thrown out of the tribe. So that is what happens a lot of the time when it comes to mental health, when it comes to addiction, is that shame. And it keeps you in unhealthy coping mechanisms, because it's more acceptable to be a big drinker than it is to be someone who admits that they're an addict or that they have a problem. Bryony Gordon, who I love, she's a fantastic role model when it comes to talking about her mental health and addiction. She says that shame dies when you expose it to the light. And we expose shame to the light by sharing our stories, by standing up and saying, this is who I am. I'm a human being, I'm fallible, I make mistakes, I have struggle. And the more we do that, the more we have a ripple effect of showing other people that they're not alone and that it's okay to stand up and say who you really are. I often think that we see vulnerability in ourselves as a weakness, but when we see other people being vulnerable, we see it as a strength. People being role models, trailblazing when it comes to saying, we're all human beings and life is hard and life is difficult and we don't all have it perfect all the time, and it's okay to share these things. And the more we do, the more we create this environment where we support people rather than people having to suffer alone and in silence. Addiction, it thrives in the darkness. It breeds on shame. It loves isolation. So let's cut off its life force. Let's shine that light and show people that it's okay to share our experiences, that we're more than just our addiction or our mental illnesses. Let's transform the story. Let's share our stories, normalize the struggle. Because I'm an alcoholic, I'm an addict, but I'm also a mother, a successful businesswoman, a best friend, a daughter, a human being. So the more we can share our stories and challenge that stigma or that preconception of what addiction or mental illness looks like, then we can encourage an environment and create a culture where everyone feels empowered and safe to stand up and say, this is who I truly am. Thank you.